Wholesome Reader back again with Chapter 10 of Father to Nobody's Children. Struggles with critics, doubters, and the legal system. It seems it is almost impossible to accomplish anything important without creating enemies, and Bernardo created a lot. Barroom owners were out to get him for ruining their businesses. Workers in the homes whom he had fired for incompetence, laziness, or dishonesty were angry with him. Parents who had turned their children out into the street were hoping to get their hands on them again now that their offspring had been educated and taught a valuable trade. And of course, there were always general gossips and busybodies who couldn't or wouldn't believe that someone would work so hard for poor children without some secret and sinister motive. The attack on Bernardo's ministry began with occasional rumors about the homes, but nothing firm enough to be challenged. Then Mrs. Bernardo began receiving anonymous letters accusing her husband of terrible sins and calling him a shameful hypocrite. Bernardo also received similar letters attacking his wife and other workers in the homes. At first, the workers at the homes ignored the letters and rumors, but before long they grew more frequent and outrageous. The children, these gossips said, were half-starved and beaten and were often punished by being thrown into rat-infested dungeons. The descriptions of these fictitious jail cells were wild. There were no beds. Mud oozed through cracks in the floor. The victims were fed bread and water. The rats were even said to nibble at the boys' toes. Anyone who was familiar with the ministry of Dr. Bernardo's homes would have laughed at these rumors, but to those who were just hearing of the man and his work, the worst lies sounded all too possible. After all, how could all these stories have been started if there was not some portion of truth in them? When the rumors were compiled and published anonymously by a social worker who claimed to be a fellow Christian, Bernardo made a grave mistake. He lost his temper. In the heat of anger, he gathered facts to refute the charges and handed them over to a friend. This friend published an anonymous letter in the local paper defending Dr. Bernardo and discrediting his enemies. When Bernardo's critics responded with even greater attacks, the anonymous friend wrote a second letter, this time attacking the critics personally. The lack of self-control and pettiness shown by the letter writer increased the heat of the argument. Soon the enemies of Bernardo were saying that the doctor himself had written the letters. They then accused him of blowing his own horn and trying to silence anyone who criticized him. Bernardo was embarrassed by his friend's second letter, though he appreciated the good intentions behind it. The letter was a poor witness for Christ. Even though it might mean losing close friendship, he felt it his duty to publicly reject the letter and state clearly that he had not written it. In a letter to the East London Observer, Bernardo described his friend's second letter as atrocious and abominable, and it commented with grim humor, "Well may I say, save me from my friends." It might have been easier on him if he had revealed the identity of the letter writer, but he refused. The author's identity remains a secret to this day. For 2 years the issue appeared to be closed, but the foes of Bernardo merely went underground. A new storm of controversy broke with the publishing of a 62-page booklet entitled Dr. Bernardo's Home, containing startling revelations. The booklet repeated the rumors that had been circulated earlier, and even came up with more. Bernardo's appeals for funds were clever lies, the booklet claimed. The photos of homeless children dressed in rags were faked, and the money he received of the poor he was spending on himself. The old rumors of imprisoning children in dungeons, overworking and starving them, were all included in gruesome detail, as well as the charge that he had written the letters that had caused so much controversy 2 years before. But worse than all these were new accusations. Bernardo had been seen in the company of drunken, immoral women. Bernardo had no visible income, so he must be dipping into the funds for the children to support himself. The children in his homes were receiving no moral or religious training. Bernardo was not a physician and had no right to call himself doctor. The author of the booklet concluded that Bernardo was nothing more than a con artist, swindling his donors by appealing to their emotions with exaggerated stories of poor children starving on the street. The arrogant and hateful attitude of the booklet was evident in one of its summary statements. He who sees not these abuses is absolutely blind, and he who attempts to excuse them is absolutely insane. The booklet was filled with half-truths and outright lies, but they were stated so cleverly that it was difficult to refute them. It was true, for example, that Bernardo had been seen in the company of drunken women, but his obvious purpose was to lead them to Christ. Jesus himself had the same accusation thrown at him when he associated with sinners, and he responded, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." It was also true that Bernardo had no visible income, but he had no need to dip into the funds for the homes because his father sent him a monthly living allowance to subsidize his work. He also received payment for various articles he wrote for magazines and newspapers. In addition, Mrs. Bernardo came from a wealthy family and had a large private income of her own. The claim that there was no moral or religious training in the homes was ridiculous. The children's daily schedule included morning and evening prayer. The Bible was a regular part of the lessons in the Ragged schools. Much more training in spiritual things was done informally by the staff. The criticism against the religious training in the homes showed that the author had never investigated his charges. The accusation that Bernardo had no right to call himself doctor was one of the sneakiest of the booklet's statements. Though it was a minor point, the author of the booklet claimed it was evidence that Bernardo was an out-and-out fraud. The whole argument hinged on the definition of the word doctor. Strictly speaking, the only persons who could legitimately be called doctor were those who had an advanced medical degree, and Bernardo's schooling had been interrupted by his growing ministry. But in England it was common to give the title doctor to anyone who had had at least some medical training. Bernardo had been called doctor ever since he began treating patients with cholera during his second year as a medical student. Bernardo did not know how to respond to the booklet's attack. He could, of course, sue the author for libel, but Bernardo did not believe in taking someone to court. There was one action he could take. He could complete his medical training. Within a short time, he was a licensed medical practitioner in London. Now, at least, they couldn't criticize him for being called doctor. Meanwhile, the rumors continued to swirl around Bernardo's head, and his refusal to take the booklet's author to court made it appear that he had no defense for the charges. The charity organization Society, a group formed to keep an eye on charities, put Dr. Bernardo's homes on its cautionary list, which put a cloud of suspicion over the ministry. If something wasn't done soon, public confidence in the homes would collapse, and the donations would cease. Fortunately for Bernardo, he had some influential and creative friends who came up with a way to avoid a conventional lawsuit. They persuaded the author of the booklet to present his charges before a board of arbitration. A senior judge, a prominent clergyman, and a former member of Parliament agreed to serve on the board. The government gave the board members full authority to issue a legal decision after they had heard the evidence. For 20 days, the booklet's author, through his attorneys, presented his case against Bernardo, calling 47 witnesses to prove their charges. Then Bernardo and his lawyer began their defense. They called 65 witnesses over 18 days before Bernardo himself took the witness stand. This was the opportunity Bernardo's accusers had been waiting for. By this point in the trial, they realized that their case against Bernardo was flimsy. They had failed to make any of their charges stick. Their only hope was to embarrass or anger Bernardo enough to get him to say something incriminating. During cross-examination, the booklet's attorney pressed Bernardo to identify his friend, the one who had written the 2 anonymous letters that caused so much trouble 2 years earlier. He obviously refused, saying that the author had repented of his rash statements, did not deserve to be made into a public spectacle. Bernardo's accusers, of course, insisted that the letter writer's name was crucial information. When Bernardo continued to refuse, the booklet author and his lawyers gathered up their papers and left in a huff, hoping to create the impression that they had been treated unfairly. The arbitration board was not impressed by the prosecution's dramatic exit. In fact, they saw it as a golden opportunity to bring the hearing to a conclusion. The members of the board had spent 39 days hearing the testimony of over 100 witnesses. During that time, all the charges had been thoroughly debated. The board had also made personal on-site inspections of every one of Bernardo's orphanages. They had even ordered a complete audit of the ministry's financial records by a top-notch accounting firm. They were ready to pass judgment. 5 weeks later, the 3 board members issued a 10,000-word report explaining their decision in detail. On the main accusation, misuse of funds, Bernardo was found entirely innocent. The accounting firm that checked the financial records found Bernardo's bookkeeping to be a model of efficiency. There was no evidence that any donations were spent by Bernardo for his personal use. The board concluded that the children in Dr. Bernardo's homes were well fed and received a good education, including religious training. We are of the opinion that these homes for destitute boys and girls, the board declared in its report, are real and valuable charities and worth of public confidence and support. On some of the minor points, however, the board did find fault with a few of Bernardo's day-to-day practices. The rumors of rat-infested dungeons were the product of some gossip's wild imagination, but they had some basis in fact. Bernardo and his staff had occasionally put their most unruly boys in solitary confinement, not in a damp, dark cellar, but in a small room set aside for that purpose. The homes had discontinued the practice by the time the board issued its report. The accusation that photos of homeless children dressed in rags were faked also had some basis in fact. The vast majority of photos that Bernardo published were of actual street children, but a small number had been posed. The board referred to the obviously posed photos as artistic fiction, concluding they were not intended to deceive donors, but were published merely to show what a typical homeless child looks like. Close-up shots of actual homeless children were probably hard to obtain. How could they get such a child to stand still long enough to take a picture? At any rate, the board decided there was no intent to trick the public. Though it was convinced that all the money donated to the homes had been spent wisely, the board did not feel it looked good for Bernardo to serve as his own treasurer as well as the mission's sole decision-maker. Reluctantly, Bernardo agreed. He had started his ministry as almost a one-man operation, but as the work had grown, he had failed to delegate the responsibilities. On the advice of the Board of Arbitration, the mission formed a committee to help Bernardo oversee the work of the homes. The Apostle Paul promised that all things work together for good to them that love God. The storm of controversy that Bernardo went through was, in the long run, good for him and for his orphanages. It helped him identify and strengthen the weak spots in an otherwise strong ministry, preparing him for more fruitful service. Later, his ministry went through other legal battles, mostly over the issue of custody of children. Bernardo would often take in children whose parents had abandoned them. Then sometimes years later, the parents would demand the child's return, usually because their son or daughter had learned a trade, and they saw they could make money through the child. These lawsuits sickened Bernardo. He didn't want to see a boy or girl forced to live a life of poverty and starvation just so parents could have money for liquor. One would think that the law would be on Bernardo's side, but it wasn't. The law of England at that time gave parents absolute power over their children. Even if they beat and abused their children, parents had little to fear from the law. Even if they gave their children away to someone like Bernardo, parents could later demand them back. It didn't matter that they had signed an agreement to give Bernardo full and permanent custody. They could just change their minds. Under the law, a child custody agreement was just about worthless. Bernardo lost these lawsuits, but the publicity they generated put public pressure on Parliament to change the law. The new law, which required parents to abide by a custody agreement, was popularly known as the Bernardo Act. None of Bernardo's later legal battles was as difficult as the first one, the hearing before the arbitration board, but they all had one thing in common. God used them to strengthen his ministry and publicize the needs of his children. All in all, Bernardo could look back at these struggles in the light of God's faithfulness and even be thankful for his enemies. And that's the end of chapter 10.